can contact the department for assistance.
Thank you very
much, Mr. Speaker, and I very much welcome the idea of the Advanced British Standard Assessment, and I do think the name is unwieldy. The acronym name is used elsewhere, and it's very difficult to export. That aside, has there been any more exploration into what the curriculum would look like? For how many years would young people need to study for the qualification? And does this mean the end of GCSEs?
No, it doesn't, Mr. Speaker. The Advanced British Standard will offer a broad, balanced and knowledge-rich curriculum that builds on reforms of the last decade. Its curriculum will form a core part of the formal consultation in the coming months. GCSEs remain important, rigorous and highly regarded qualifications, providing preparation for the new Advanced British Standard.
Steve McKay.
When does the Minister anticipate it might be possible to deliver at least half of all education, health and care plans for SEND children within the government's own legal time frame?
We're undertaking a significant programme of reform to make sure that EHCPs are delivered in the right time frame, but also so that children can get the support that they need at an earlier stage without needing one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend outline the support provided to the Metropolitan Borough of Bury by the government to enhance educational provision for children with special educational needs?
Well, the Metropolitan Borough of Bury is getting significant support. In addition to the funding increases, we've appointed a SEND advisor to work with them to improve services, the Council for Disabled Children supporting them to strengthen EHCPs. We've opened two special free schools have been approved, and they're also one of 34 areas in our safety valve programme.
In recent weeks, we've seen reported instances of anti-Semitism rise by 1,300% and Islamophobia by 150%. Jewish kids afraid to go to school and Muslim kids asked, whose side are you on? What is the government doing to ensure that children are taught about the wrongs of these intolerances in a sensitive but robust manner? And is there a role for Ofsted to ensure that consistency in approaching these issues is taught in all schools?
The honourable member is absolutely right. Anti-Semitism has no place in education. It was an honour to join the Secretary of State's visit to Menorah High School last week, together with the whole ministerial team, standing in solidarity with the school and with the Jewish community. We have written to all schools and colleges urging a swift response to hate-related incidents and active reassurance for their students and staff. And we continue to work with faith leaders, schools and Ofsted to monitor the response to those concerns.
Speaker, further to my honourable friend's question, since Hamas's attack, Jewish students on campus report they've had a year's worth of anti-Semitic incidents in only 2 weeks. Some have been targeted, the attack itself was celebrated, and some have received death threats. So will the Minister agree with me that universities should work with the Union of Jewish Students to publicise the welfare hotline that they've established, to avail themselves of the training that they offer, and to work to implement the recommendations of the recent report on the Task Force on Anti-Semitism in Higher Education?
I've made it clear that we're not going to tolerate anti-Semitism on campus. We're working very closely with the Union of Jewish Students and the Higher Education Jewish Chaplaincy Service, as well as the Community Security Trust. I welcome the Task Force report and its recommendations, and we absolutely urge universities to prioritise its implementation.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having recently visited a local nursery in Birdwell, I know they are very concerned about their ability to plan for provision for children in the 24-25 year. When will the government give them certainty on hourly rates?
We'll be setting out the funding rates very shortly.
Anthony Higginbotham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just one day after Hamas's brutal massacre in Israel, a student at Manchester University spoke of being full of, and I quote, pride and joy at a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Not only is this disgusting, but it points to possible extremism on our university campuses, and far too many think there are no consequences. So could my right honourable friend set out what the real consequences are for people spreading this hate in our educational settings?
I thank my honourable friend. I mentioned previously, unfortunately, we have some of Hamas's useful idiots across our campuses, and we won't stand for it. They do represent a fifth column supporting terrorism. We are doing everything possible. The prevent duty requires higher education providers to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism, and we will work with the universities to ensure that they take any extremist activity very seriously.
Mike Ainsbury, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. James, 14-year-old lad from my constituency, has been passed from pillar to post in terms of schools. He just simply can't deal with his ADHD and autism. Would the Minister meet with me about this specific case?
I'd be delighted to meet with the Honourable Gentleman.
Right, that completes questions. We now come to the statement. I call the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, last week I visited the Middle East, bringing a message of solidarity with the region against terror and against the further spread of conflict. I met with the leaders of Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt and the Palestinian Authority to coordinate our response to the crisis before us, but also to renew the better vision of the future that Hamas is trying to destroy. I travelled first to Israel. It is a nation in mourning. But, Mr. Speaker, it is also a nation under attack. The violence against Israel did not end on the 7th of October. Hundreds of rockets are launched at their towns and cities every day. And Hamas still holds around 200 hostages, including British citizens. In Jerusalem, I met some of the relatives who are suffering unbearable torment. Their pain will stay with me for the rest of my days. I'm doing everything in my power and working with all our partners to get their loved ones home. So in my meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Herzog, I told them once again that we stand resolutely with Israel in defending itself against terror. And I stressed again the need to act in line with international humanitarian law and take every possible step to avoid harming civilians. It was a message delivered by a close friend and ally. I say it again, we stand with Israel. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I recognise that the Palestinian people are suffering terribly. Over 4,000 Palestinians have been killed in this conflict. They are also the victims of Hamas, who embed themselves in the civilian population. Too many lives have already been lost, and the humanitarian crisis is growing. I went to the region to address these issues directly. In Riyadh, then Cairo, I met individually with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman from Saudi Arabia, the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, President Sisi in Egypt, and President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. These were further to my meetings with the King of Jordan last week and calls with other leaders, and my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary's extensive travel in the region. Mr. Speaker, there are three abiding messages from all of these conversations. The first is that we must continue working together to get more humanitarian support into Gaza. The whole House will welcome the limited opening of the Rafah crossing. It is important progress and testament to the power of diplomacy, but it is not enough. We need a constant stream of aid pouring in, bringing the water, food, medicine and fuel that is so desperately needed. So we will keep up the diplomatic pressure. We've already committed £10 million of extra support to help civilians in Gaza. And Mr. Speaker, I can announce today that we are going further. We are providing an additional £20 million of humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza, more than doubling our previous support to the Palestinian people. There are major logistical and political challenges to delivering this aid, which I discussed with President Sisi. My Right Honourable friend, the Development Minister, is leading an effort to ensure the maximum amount of aid is pre-positioned with UK support ready to deliver. We're also working intensively to ensure that British nationals trapped in Gaza are able to leave through the Rafah crossing when it properly reopens. The second message, Mr. Speaker, is that this is not a time for hyperbole and simplistic solutions. It is a time for quiet and dogged diplomacy that recognises the hard realities on the ground and delivers help now. And we have an important role to play. In all of my meetings, people were clear that they value Britain's engagement. The UK's voice matters. We have deep ties across the region, ties of defence, trade and investment, but also of history. President Abbas pointed to that history, not the British mandate in Palestine or the Balfour Declaration, but the UK's efforts over decades to support the two-state solution. And that brings me to my third point, Mr. Speaker. Growing attacks by Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, rising tensions on the West Bank, and missiles and drones launched from Yemen show that some are seeking escalation. So we need to invest more deeply in regional stability and in the two-state solution. Last night I spoke to the leaders of the United States, Germany, France, Italy, and Canada. We are all determined to prevent escalation. That's why I'm deploying RAF and Royal Navy assets, monitoring threats to regional security and supporting humanitarian efforts. Mr. Speaker, our support for a two-state solution is highly valued across the region. But it can't just be a cliched talking point to roll out at times like this. The truth is that in recent years, energy has moved into other avenues like the Abraham Accords and normalisation talks with Saudi Arabia. We support those steps, absolutely, and believe that they can bolster wider efforts. But we must never lose sight of how essential the two-state solution is. So we'll work together with our international partners to bring renewed energy and creativity to this effort. It will rely on establishing more effective governance for Palestinian territories in Gaza and the West Bank. It will also mean challenging actions that undercut legitimate aspirations for Palestinian statehood. Mr. Speaker, Hamas care more about their paymasters in Iran than the children they hide behind. So let me be clear. There is no scenario where Hamas can be allowed to control Gaza or any part of the Palestinian territories. Hamas is not only a threat to Israel, but to many others across the region. All the leaders I met agree that this is a watershed moment. It's time to set the region on a better path. Mr. Speaker, I also want to say a word about the tone of the debate. When things are so delicate, we all have a responsibility to take additional care in the language we use and to operate on the basis of facts alone. The reaction to the horrific explosion at the Al Ahli Arab Hospital was a case in point. As I indicated last week, we have taken care to look at all the evidence currently available. Mr. Speaker, I can now share our assessment with the House. On the basis of the deep knowledge and analysis of our intelligence and weapons experts, the British government judges that the explosion was likely caused by a missile, or part of one, that was launched from within Gaza towards Israel. The misreporting of this incident had a negative effect in the region, including on a vital US diplomatic effort and on tensions here at home. We need to learn the lessons and ensure that in future there is no rush to judgment. Mr. Speaker, we have seen hate on our streets again this weekend. We all stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. That is the message I brought to President Abbas. But we will never tolerate anti-Semitism in our country. Calls for jihad on our streets are not only a threat to the Jewish community, but to our democratic values. And we expect the police to take all necessary action to tackle extremism head-on. Mr. Speaker, this is a moment for great care and caution, but also for moral clarity. Hope and humanity must win out against the scourge of terrorism and aggression. The 7th of October attack was driven by hatred, but it was also driven by Hamas's fear that a new equilibrium might be emerging in the Middle East, one that would leave old divisions behind and offer hope of a better, more secure, more prosperous way forward. It is the same motivation that drives Putin's war on Ukraine, the fear of Ukraine's emergence as a modern, thriving democracy, and the desire to pull it back into some imperialist fantasy of the past. Putin will fail, and so will Hamas. We must keep alive that vision of a better future against those who seek to destroy it. Together with our partners, that is what we will do, and I commend this statement to the House.
Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of his statement. The brutal attack in Israel just over 2 weeks ago was the darkest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. 2 weeks of grief for the innocent people who lost brothers, sisters, children. 2 weeks of torture for the families whose loved ones were taken hostage by Hamas. There was a small glimmer of light this weekend, the release of 2 American hostages, Natalie and Judith Raanan. I met members of their family last week, and I know that they will be overcome with relief. But Hamas still hold hundreds more, sons, daughters, mums, dads, still missing, innocent people who could, if Hamas willed it, be released immediately. But they remain hostage because Hamas want the chaos of war. Hamas want Jews to suffer. Hamas want the Palestinian people to share in the pain because the Palestinian people are not their cause. Peace is not their aim. The dignity of human life, Jew or Muslim, means absolutely nothing to them. And in the light of their barbarism, Israel has the right to defend herself. Yes, to get their hostages home, but also to defeat Hamas, so nobody need suffer like this again. And that we might once more see a road to a lasting peace, a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. And, Mr. Speaker, this operation can and must be done within international law. We democracies know that all human life is equal. Innocent lives must be protected. These are the principles that differentiate us from the terrorists who target Israel. So there must now be clear humanitarian corridors within Gaza for those escaping violence. Civilians must not be targeted. And where Palestinians are forced to flee, they must not be permanently displaced from their homes. International law is clear. It also means basic services, including water, electricity and fuel needed for it, cannot be denied. Hamas may not care for the safety and security of the Palestinian people, but we do. We cannot and will not close our eyes to their suffering. Gaza is now a humanitarian emergency. There is not enough food. Clean water is running out. Hospitals are going without medicine and electricity. People starving, reduced to drinking contaminated filth. Babies lying in incubators that could switch off at any moment. The deal struck by the United States to get a flow of trucks through the Rafah crossing is an important first step. 20 on Saturday, 14 on Sunday. But it's nowhere near enough. Gaza is not a small town facing a few shortages. It has a population the size of Greater Manchester, a place even before this devastation where life was a struggle. Gaza needs aid, and it needs to be rapid, safe, unhindered, and regular. Countries able to provide support must step up, including the United Kingdom. And so I welcome the increased funding for humanitarian aid that the Prime Minister has announced this afternoon. The EU has promised to treble humanitarian aid, and the US has appointed a special coordinator for international aid to Gaza. So I ask if the Prime Minister can commit to the same, because Britain must stand ready to ensure aid gets to the right places, to deploy British experts and medical support teams, and to work with international partners to give UN agencies the resources they need for the long term. Because, Mr. Speaker, there is a long term. Even as we stand by Israel in her fight against Hamas, our eyes must also look to the future, a future where Israeli citizens live free from the fear of terrorist attacks, and a future for the Palestinian people, where they and their children enjoy the freedoms and opportunities that we take for granted. For too long, we've talked about a two-state solution, the dignity and justice of a Palestinian state, alongside a safe and secure Israel, without a serious path or will to make it happen. And for too long, we have allowed welcome progress in improving relations between Israel and her neighbours to sit without any progress on the future for Palestine and its people. That must change. We stand with Israel and her right to defend herself against the terrorists of Hamas. We stand for international law, the protection of innocent lives, humanitarian support for the Palestinians. And we do so because we stand for a political path to a two-state solution and a better future. These are dark days, but the light must never go out. We must not let it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his constructive comments and his support. Just to recap, on humanitarian aid, by announcing an additional £20 million today, we will be doubling our aid to the region, which is already one of the most leading contributions of any country in the world. My development minister will remind me, but I think around 10% of the UN mission in the region is funded by UK contributions. Most of our aid is funneled through them. It's also worth bearing in mind that President Sisi specifically commended the efforts of the UK alongside the US in ensuring that the Rafah crossing could be open and functioning, testament to the work of our team and the Development Minister and Foreign Secretary on the ground. I can also say, in response to the Leader of the Opposition's question with regard to the UN, that the Development Minister is in close contact on an almost daily basis with Martin Griffiths, the head of the UN's humanitarian relief efforts, to ensure that the UK can play a leading role in supporting what is happening on the ground. There are considerable logistical challenges in getting the aid to the people who need it, and those are areas where we can make a difference, particularly around El Arish, the logistical hub where supplies are moving to. And I can confirm that the Development Minister will tomorrow lay a written ministerial statement setting out further details of the increase in humanitarian aid that we've announced today. But in closing, Mr. Speaker, I concur with what the Leader of the Opposition said in my remarks earlier. There is absolutely a future available to us, which is a future more prosperous, more stable for people living in this region, where people can live with dignity, with security and with opportunity. That is the future that Hamas is trying to destroy, and we should stand united to stop that from happening.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From his discussions with Arab leaders, did my right honourable friend get any impression that they understood the purpose of Hamas terrorism to derail their efforts to find a better way of living in the Middle East? And was he satisfied that they were sufficiently aware of the benefit Russia hopes to derive from all this and the need to deter Iran from further escalation?
Prime Minister.
I can tell my honourable friend that in all my conversations across the region with Arab leaders, there is absolutely no love or affection for Hamas. Indeed, the opposite, as the Palestinian president said with me, condemned in no uncertain terms the terrorist atrocities that they have perpetrated, and all leaders see Hamas as a destabilising influence in the region and want to work with us and others to prevent the situation from escalating and to limit Hamas's ability to carry out attacks like this in the future.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I said last week that history would judge us based on our response, not just to the abhorrent terrorist attack in Israel, but in our response to the humanitarian crisis which was undoubtedly unfolding in Gaza itself. On our collective, unequivocal condemnation of the abhorrent attacks of the 7th of October, this House has been and continues to be fully united, just as we are united in our condemnation of any form of anti-Semitism which rears its head on these isles, and indeed in our thoughts and prayers for all of those hostages who need to be returned safely to their families. However, in respect of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and whilst I do welcome the announcements from the Prime Minister today, I believe that we can and must go further. And here's why. Because turning off electricity and water to Gaza is collective punishment. Limiting the free access of food and medicines to Gaza is collective punishment. Preventing people from fleeing, including British citizens, from Gaza is collective punishment. Dropping leaflets in northern Gaza telling people to flee or they will be deemed partners of Hamas is a precursor for further collective punishment. All of us in this chamber know that collective punishment is prohibited by international law. Yep. So I ask the Prime Minister to use his office to do some good on the humanitarian side of this conflict in Gaza, and to answer the question which I asked last week. Will he now, given the severity of this appalling situation, agree that a ceasefire is required in the region?
Here, here. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would characterise the situation differently to the honourable gentleman with the greatest of respect. Israel has suffered an appalling act of terror. It has the right to defend itself and ensure that something like this does not happen again. He talks about people moving from the north to the south of Gaza. It is absolutely right that Israel takes every precaution to avoid harming civilians, and indeed their president and my conversations confirmed that they intend to act within international humanitarian law. But what is happening is Hamas is preventing people from moving and keeping them in harm's way. And again, he didn't mention that in his statement, but he would do well to recognise that that's Hamas's policy. Hamas embedding itself in civilian populations, using them as human shields, and then preventing them from leaving when they've been given advance notice. Where I do agree and have been very clear is that we must do everything we can to support humanitarian efforts into Gaza, which I'll refer him to my previous comments. Particularly, I raised all these issues with the Israeli Prime Minister, and we will continue to do everything we can. And I would, again, just point out, it's not just a function of money. It is about the logistics of getting what are very considerable amounts of aid into the region, and here the UK has capability and expertise that we are very, very willing to bring to bear, and having active discussions about how best to do so.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Chelmsford Muslim community for hosting a meeting that brought together Jewish, Muslim and Christian leaders on Friday. All were deeply shocked by the events of 7th, 11th, and there is no place for hate. But there's also great concern about the loss of civilian life that's happened since then, and the risk of contagion and the situation escalating even further. So can I thank the Prime Minister what he said about how Israel, in defending itself from terror, also needs to act within international law. And can I ask, how is that acting within international law being monitored? And if there are breaches, how would any perpetrator be held to account?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend will know that there are established mechanisms for that, but I am reassured by what the Israeli President has said very publicly, and indeed my conversations, that Israel does intend to act within humanitarian law, is taking every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Ahmed Jassim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We all condemned the attacks by Hamas on innocent civilians. But since then, thousands of innocent Palestinians, including children, have been killed by the bombardment
of the Israeli army, which I also condemn. Over 1 million Palestinians are displaced, and many more are suffering without access to food, water, electricity, fuel, and medicines, which is inhumane and against international law. So will the Prime Minister join me in calling for a ceasefire today to end this collective punishment?
Prime Minister.
Again, I'd say to honourable gentlemen, Israel has the right to defend itself in line with international humanitarian law, and they have our support in doing that.
Can I just say to everybody, we'll run this till 5 o'clock, so let's help each other get everybody in. Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How can members of the British Jewish community feel safe when people are allowed to chant on the streets of Britain in favour of jihad, call for the raising of religious armies to go and fight Israel, and call for the mobilisation of the Intifada, and walk down our streets holding signs which display despicable, ancient anti-Semitic tropes? These are not marches for peace, Mr. Speaker. These are marches for hate. They are glorifying the murder, the worst murder of Jews since the Holocaust, and they have to stop, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, hateful extremism has no place in our society. Calls for jihad and for Muslim armies to rise up are not only a threat to the Jewish community, but also a threat to our democratic values. Now, of course, the police are operationally independent, but the Home Secretary has a role in holding police forces to account, and as members will know, she has raised this matter with the Met Police Commissioner at their meeting earlier today. Anyone who commits a crime, whether that be inciting racial hatred, glorifying terrorism, or violating public order, should expect to face the full force of the law.
Ed Davey.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement? Can I agree with him and the Leader of the Opposition that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is truly horrifying? To prevent a catastrophe, it is essential that far more aid reaches the people who need it. And it is vital that the hostages are unconditionally released. Hamas's evil attacks have claimed far too many innocent lives already. Israel unquestionably has the right to protect its citizens and target these brutal terrorists in line with international law, just as we all have a duty to prevent more needless civilian deaths. So does the Prime Minister agree with many of us, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, that the UK should be leading diplomatic efforts to secure a pause in hostilities with a temporary humanitarian ceasefire to allow for the hostages to be released and to get aid into Gaza?
Prime Minister.
I just say to my honourable friend exactly what I have been trying to do over the past week, ensure that we can diplomatically engage with partners in the region, as indeed has the Foreign Secretary been doing, which has resulted in humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. More needs to come, but that is a sign of progress. And in all our conversations, particularly with the Emir of Qatar, we are focused on releasing hostages of all nationalities, but are particularly concerned about the British hostages that there are, and we will continue to have that engagement with our partners to do everything in our power to secure the release of those hostages.
Mr. Blunt.
My right honourable friend knows, and I'm one of the members of this House that takes the most satisfaction, that it is he who is Prime Minister of this great democratic country with all the powers of analysis that he brings to his role. And we are all in this nation accountable before the law, or indeed perhaps anyone that isn't has to act on his advice anyway. And he is accountable before the law like everyone else. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, but we don't quite get to the conclusion, because this is a watershed moment. And we are either going to build a future which is based on a killing field in Gaza, or we are going to have a ceasefire and the opportunity to bring the necessary aid there for all those people who are suffering now so appallingly. My right honourable friend knows that we must operate within the law. The law is clear, and it requires a ceasefire now in order to be implemented.
Mr. Speaker, it is difficult to tell Israel to have a ceasefire when it is still facing rocket fire on an almost daily basis. and when its citizens are still being held hostage and it has suffered an appalling terrorist attack where it has a right to defend itself. But, as I've said, it is important that that is done in accordance with international law, and it's important that Israel takes every possible precaution to avoid harming civilians. And based on all my conversations, that is something that we will continue to expect and continue to impress upon the Israeli government.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nobody is arguing that Israel has a right to defend itself, but my constituents want to know what has already been asked actually by members from his own side. What happens if international law is not followed? Can the Prime Minister give some assurance to the country and certainly to people in my constituency that if Israel breaches international law in their endeavours to defend themselves, that he will stand at that dispatch box and say so?
Prime Minister.
I would just, as the Honourable Lady well knows, there are established processes and mechanisms to take account of international law, but again, we cannot lose sight just a week or two later about the fact that Hamas, an absolutely evil terrorist organisation, has perpetrated a horrific attack on over 1,000 people in Israel, and they have the right to defend themselves and ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend and for his attempts in the Middle East recently, and also his reminder that it's the UK, regardless of political party, that has been behind a two-state solution from the very word go. But it's also becoming very clear, as he referenced, that Iran's hand is behind all of what happened in the murderous, genocidal and kidnapping of Jewish and Israelis, people. And therefore I ask the simple question, Mr. Speaker, if we know all this, and we now know that they're abroad in the UK creating useful idiots to go out and promote their propaganda, is it not time that we review again the role of the IRGC, the review to actually banning its activities, and also the banks, the Iranian banks here in the UK, in the City of London, why are they still here getting money and putting that money to terrorist activities?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have already taken strong action, including sanctioning more than 350 different Iranian individuals and entities, including the IRGC in its entirety. Furthermore, the National Security Act of this year implements new measures to protect the British public, including new offences for espionage and foreign interference. And as my honourable friend knows, we don't comment on specific organisations and whether they're being considered for prescription, but he can rest assured that we discuss Iran and how best to contain it with all our allies on a regular basis.
Zara Sultan.
Indiscriminate bombing and obliterating entire neighbourhoods is a war crime. Collective punishment and starving a population of necessities is a war crime. Ordering 1.1 million people to leave their homes and forcibly displacing them, that is a war crime as well. Mr. Speaker, I absolutely condemn Hamas's killing of Israeli civilians, and I echo the calls for the release of hostages, but that does not excuse war crimes. And merely saying international law should be followed when it is clearly not being followed is an insult. So, Prime Minister, I ask, how many more Palestinians must die before the Prime Minister condemns Israel for violating international law and calls for an immediate ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I've been very clear, we support the Palestinian people because they are victims of Hamas too. And we mourn the loss of every innocent life, civilians of every faith, every nationality who have been killed in this conflict. But I simply disagree with the Honourable Lady in her characterisation of what is going on. There is a significant difference between a terrorist organisation that deliberately and specifically targeted the killing, mutilation and murder of innocent civilians, including children and women and babies, a couple of weeks ago, and Israel's lawful right to defend itself and go after those perpetrators.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for all of the efforts that he and his team are making at this time. In the important discussions that he was having with leaders in the region at the end of last week about getting more humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and that's exactly right, was he able to get new information regarding the welfare of hostages that have been taken by Hamas into Gaza, which includes many elderly people, toddlers with medical needs, disabled people? Isn't it important that we make sure they're not forgotten and that the supplies going into Gaza reach the hostages as well?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend raised an excellent point and I thank him for it. It is difficult to precisely ascertain that information, but can I provide him the reassurance that we are extensively talking to our partners, and I had a very constructive conversation with the Emir of Qatar on this issue to put pressure on those holding these hostages to unconditionally release them and ensure their well-being in the meantime.
Steve McCabe.
I welcome the Prime Minister's statement. Hizb ut-Tahrir are a fundamentalist organisation who are banned in 40 countries and across most of the Arab world. Why are they allowed to parade on the streets of London and call for the destruction of the State of Israel?
Mr. Speaker, as I previously said, we of course keep the list of prescribed organisations under review, but do not routinely comment on whether an organisation is or is not under consideration for prescription. What I would also say is I refer the Honourable Gentleman to his comments, the comments that I made before. Hateful extremism of the type that we saw this weekend has no place in our society, and it should be met with the full force of the law.
Mr. Speaker. A group of 100 journalists from around the world have just been shown some indescribable raw footage of the Hamas attacks in a private screening. According to a BBC journalist, it included a father and two sons, aged roughly 7 and 9, seen running into a shelter in their underwear. The terrorist throws a grenade into the shelter, killing the father, badly injuring the two boys, who run back into the house covered in blood. The two children are screaming for their father and saying they are going to die. The terrorist is seen calmly drinking water from the family's fridge. That's just one of the videos that have been shown to 100 journalists from around the world in the last couple of hours. Will the Prime Minister confirm that any person in the United Kingdom supporting this vicious terrorism will be subject to the full force of the law?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I saw much of the same footage myself on my visit last week to Israel, and I can tell the House it is absolutely horrifying to watch. And when we hear in this House, it's important to have those images in our mind. What happens is unforgivable, and they have every right to defend themselves against that. But I can also tell my honourable friend and provide him with the reassurance, as he will know well, under the terrorism acts of both 2001 and 2006, glorification of terrorism, support of prescribed organisations, or encouragement of terrorism are all offensive and offences and will be met with the full force of the law.
This is a moment for moral clarity, and I agree with him. The humanitarian situation is just dire in Gaza at the moment. 34 trucks have gone in. That's set against a backdrop of normally hundreds going in every day. We're on the precipice of children, women, people in hospital dying because of shortage of power, water and food. Aid is, welcome the money for aid, but if it can't get in, it's not helping. What can the Prime Minister do to get this aid in the quantities and amounts that is going to save unavoidable deaths in Gaza?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as President Sisi himself last week commended the United Kingdom for our diplomatic efforts ensuring the access of humanitarian aid into Gaza, and I thank my honourable friends, the Foreign Secretary and Development Minister, for their efforts in this regard. And in this House, we should be proud of the UK's efforts in ensuring that access is now open. Of course, we need more, and that's why the logistical support that we can provide to ensure that higher volumes of aid can flow freely to the people who need it is imperative, and the Development Minister is extensively engaged with the UN on that topic.
Nicky Aitken.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement. My constituency has been the location for two major solidarity with Palestine protests over the last 2 Saturdays, and I suspect there will be more to come. The Jewish community in Westminster have highlighted to me that the start of these protests are literally minutes' walk from synagogues, and they coincide with the end of Shabbat services. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that consideration moving forward, if these protests are going to go ahead, that the timing and the location of the start of these protests should be considered to take into consideration that the Jewish community are still very, very worried about their safety, and it coincides with their Shabbat?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue? And there is no place for demonstrations, convoys or flag waving on British streets that not just glorifies terrorism but also harasses the Jewish community. There is no place for anti-Semitism on our streets, which is why we've also increased funding for the Community Security Trust to protect British Jews from these types of incidents. I think the decisions that she refers to are typically operational decisions for the police and local communities, but I'll very much bear in mind what she says in our further engagement with those entities and individuals.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and thank him for his calmness in the face of such barbarity that the world has witnessed, and indeed welcome the comments by the Leader of the Opposition and agree with the solidarity that has been expressed, hopefully profoundly, across this House. I want to draw the Prime Minister's attention to the murder by the terrorists of Kim Damty. Kim Damty was a 22-year-old Irish-Israeli woman. I've searched this city long and hard for a book of condolence for her. Unfortunately, it's not to be found in the Irish Embassy or anywhere else. But I wanted to put her name on record, that she too is immortalised and remembered forever.
Prime Minister.
Well, I know Kim's family, we were grateful to my honourable friend for what he said, and I know that the whole House's thoughts will be them at this unspeakably difficult time.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hamas have not just abducted civilians, but have refused to release proof of life or lists, which is clearly adding even more to the distress. Would my right honourable friend outline the steps that he's taking to ensure that the Red Cross does everything possible to extract this information from this terror group?
One of the things we've been discussing with our regional partners, including the Qataris, is how best to ensure humanitarian access to those hostages and better information as to their well-being, and it's something that we will continue to press on.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The killings on October the 7th were appalling and they have to be totally condemned, as everyone has done today. The loss, however, of 5,000 Palestinian lives in Gaza is continuing and getting worse. The question is, why did the Prime Minister instruct Britain's representative of the UN not to support the call for a very minimal thing, which is a humanitarian pause to allow aid to go in and a ceasefire to take place to start to bring about a process of peace? Ultimately, that's the only way forward. Ultimately, the only way forward is the end to the occupation. Ultimately, the only way forward is recognition of the rights of the people of Palestine.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our regional and diplomatic engagement has extensively been focused about how we can bring about a better and brighter future for the people of Palestine and the Palestinians. But I would say to the honourable gentleman, I'm surprised he hasn't made any reference to the fact that an organisation that he once described as a friend has perpetrated an absolutely appalling act of terrorism on over 1,000 people.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this afternoon, the All-Party Group for Israel, of which I co-chair, heard from victims, the families of victims and the families of hostages held in Gaza. The one ask they had, above all else, was, of course, the hostages to be returned home, safe and sound. But there are babies, aged 9 months, many elderly people who are totally dependent on medicines that were not being carried with them when they were taken hostage. Now, he's already mentioned the role of the International Red Cross. Could he update the House on what is happening about enabling the International Red Cross to gain access to the hostages and supplying those hostages with the medicines they need to keep them alive?
Prime Minister.
I can tell my honourable friend that is exactly what we are trying to do, working with the Egyptian Red Crescent as well, who are engaged on the ground, and our priority is food, water, medicines and fuel to those who need it, and we'll continue extensively in dialogue with partners to increase both the speed and duration of the aid and help get it to the people who need it.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we can all agree that there is no place on our streets for hateful extremism. So I wondered what the Prime Minister has to say to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, who says at the moment law enforcement do not have the powers that they need to combat hateful extremism.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the Home Secretary met with the police chiefs this morning. Of course, we continue in dialogue with them. Where there are gaps in the law, we're happy to address and look at those. But we do believe at the moment the police do have the powers to arrest those who are inciting violence or racial hatred. There is no place on our streets for that type of behaviour, and we will work extensively to clarify the guidance to officers on the ground so they are aware fully about the powers and tools that are available to them to make sure these people feel the force of the law.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his dignified strength and leadership in these challenging times, and indeed the leadership of his colleague, the Foreign Secretary, our colleague. There is a time for peace and a time for war, and of course this is a time of war for Israel. But post-conflict, does the Prime Minister agree with me that we cannot go back to the status quo? There will need to be a comprehensive peace settlement for the region as a whole, involving many actors in the region, perhaps some people may not even want to talk to today. And whilst Britain and the United States will be at the vanguard of that, it has to be a regional solution and a long-lasting solution, and the people of Gaza should never ever be represented by an organisation that wants to kill rather than save lives.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank Honourable Fem for an excellent contribution, and he's absolutely right. The Foreign Secretary and I are having those conversations with people across the region as we speak. We cannot go back to the status quo ante. That isn't right, isn't acceptable, and that means we have to work positively and with energy on a better future for the people of Gaza, especially, and that is a huge priority for us in the coming days and weeks.
Russia Nara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1,400 Israelis have been killed by Hamas attacks, which I utterly condemn. Over 4,700 Palestinians have been killed by the airstrikes, and according to Save the Children, a child is dying every 15 minutes inside Gaza. Last week, I asked the Prime Minister about what steps are being taken to de-escalate the conflict so that it doesn't engulf the wider region. This is happening. Can he say more about what he is doing to support any other UN resolutions that may help de-escalate the conflict and create the humanitarian space that is desperately needed to help civilians and bring some kind of end to this conflict?
Prime Minister.
I say that the biggest risk on escalation comes from Iran and its destabilising behaviour. We saw worrying rocket attacks from the Houthis over the past few days, but also increasing rocket fire from Hezbollah. It is important that those are restrained, and our engagement, particularly with Arab leaders, is focused on them putting pressure on those who have influence in the region to de-escalate those tensions. We've sent Navy assets to the region to help also and make sure that arms shipments aren't getting to those nefarious actors.
Dr. Matthew Wofford.
Events in Israel and Gaza have a direct influence upon my constituents. In May 2021, a convoy for Palestine drove through North London with loudspeakers advocating that people raped women, Jewish girls and mothers. On Saturday, as the Prime Minister said, the words jihad were called for on the streets of London, and a London Underground driver also said the same over the tannoy. And only yesterday, a long-term resident of my own constituency has been identified as a Hamas operative, and indeed 2 further names have been drawn to my attention. The Prime Minister says that action will be taken, but it simply is not. My constituents don't expect the law to be enforced, they demand it.
Prime
Can I thank my honourable friend for everything he does to champion particularly his Jewish constituents and the community more broadly. I can let him know that at this point I'm aware of over 38 arrests that have been made by the police over the past week or two on this particular issue. And on the other issue that he mentioned, the British Transport Police are actively working with Transport to London to look into that issue. Of course, that's an operational matter for the police, but the government is clear that everyone should have the right to travel safely and without intimidation. And I would also hope that the Mayor of London and the others responsible for transport would take steps to make sure that that is the case.
Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In their joint policy statements, the Prime Minister, President Biden and the other leaders said that they are committed to continue coordinating with partners in the region to ensure sustained and safe access to food, water, medical care and other assistance required to meet humanitarian needs. Now, fuel is not mentioned specifically. However, in his statement on page 4, line 7, the Prime Minister does mention fuel. Is securing the delivery of fuel an UK policy aim only, or is it the joint position of all the leaders?
Prime Minister.
I'd say the UK is working hard to ensure humanitarian aid gets to the people who need it, and fuel is one of the things that we are working on.
Paul Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement today of an extra £20 million in humanitarian aid. Last week, I met with a group of senior leaders from my mosques in Bolton, and at the very end, a note got passed to me, and I read this note, and it said that can we stop just having words on the two-state solution and actually have some action? And I welcome what the Prime Minister has said, and looking to the future, and I recognise we're in the acute moments of the conflict right now, but what ideas and international collaboration as well as leadership will we put in to bring about a two-state solution? Because where there's a vacuum, others will fill it.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is right that we need to redouble our efforts and inject fresh energy into demonstrating progress towards that better future. And the most immediate thing we can do is ensure that there is a future in Gaza after Hamas that provides Palestinians with the opportunity to live with dignity and security. And that's something that we're actively engaged on with our international counterparts.
Tim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, you state in your statement that you stand with the people of Palestine and recognise their suffering, but according to NGOs on the ground in Gaza, 100 children are dying every day due to Israeli aerial bombardment. Military solutions are not going to end this conflict, only an immediate ceasefire. So are you going to call for an immediate ceasefire, yes or no?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this House stands united in saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. Then it should stand united with Israel's right to defend itself in line with international humanitarian law.
Anthony Bagnall.
Mr. Speaker, after the appalling protests this weekend, will the Prime Minister endorse the October declaration that so many members of this House have signed and the other place and encourage all people across this country to stand up for British Jews? Can I also welcome the decision to double aid into this situation? But can he reassure the House that not a single penny of it will fall into the hands of Hamas?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend obviously speaks with experience on this issue, and I can assure him that the Development Minister is very seized of that particular question. Historically, the vast bulk of our aid has been both humanitarian and channelled through the UN, but we will of course be making sure that it gets to the people who need it and not siphoned off or hijacked by Hamas.
Ben Bradshaw.
I hope the Prime Minister is right in his belief that these recent traumas could give fresh impetus to a process towards a two-state solution, because frankly, I think to many of us that seems further away than it has for decades. But in that context, what's his understanding of the Israeli government's medium and long-term strategy in the event that their ground operation in Gaza goes ahead?
Prime Minister.
The Israeli government obviously is best placed to speak for itself, but they have a right to defend themselves. They have said very clearly they want to protect their citizens. I think they not just have a right to do that, they have a duty to do that, to ensure that attacks like this can't happen ever again.
Chris Villiers.
Constituents of mine have been in touch to express how appalled they are about Times newspaper report that an individual with known links to Hamas was not only given UK citizenship, he was given a council house and allowed to buy it at a discount. Can the Prime Minister investigate this case to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the House will understand, and my honourable friend will understand, I can't comment on any individual case, but the Metropolitan Police have set out that they will always take appropriate action when provided with information about alleged activity that may be linked to terrorism perpetrated either abroad or here in the UK.
John MacDonald.
We stand on the edge of the land invasion of Gaza, which will put at risk both Palestinian lives and the hostages' lives. What estimate has the Prime Minister made of the potential number of civilian casualties that will take place if the land invasion goes ahead? And can I ask on a constituency matter, 4 weeks ago the Muslim Women's Centre in my constituency suffered an arson attack, which was particularly distressing for them because the room they targeted, they burnt the Holy Quran. What assistance will be provided to the Muslim centres that have been under attack in that way?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can say to the honourable gentleman, that we will not tolerate anti-Muslim hatred in any form and will seek to stamp it out wherever it occurs. In June earlier this year, the Security Minister confirmed additional funding of around £24.5 million will be available to provide protective security at mosques and Muslim faith schools, and the deadline for the protective security scheme has been extended to cover more applications.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you. Can I pay tribute to my right honourable friends for the region to bring about a positive influence. On Friday evening offered the smallest of hopes to many people for further releases as time goes on. In my right honourable friend's statement on Friday, he specifically referred to Qatar and Israel. Can my right honourable friend say a little bit more about the negotiations and the influence he's bringing about, and the hope that we will see further hostages released as a result?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Qatar is an important ally to the UK. We have a wide-ranging bilateral relationship, and because of that, it is helpful to be able to discuss with the Emir of Qatar their efforts, and they are taking a lead on this to secure the release of hostages. We very much, and I welcomed and commend their leadership in helping to secure the release of the first 2 hostages, but I know the Emir and Qatar are focused on securing further releases and will continue to work closely with them.
Brendan O'Hara.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I was disappointed that nowhere in this statement did the word ceasefire appear. And of course we absolutely and unreservedly condemn Hamas embedding itself within the civilian population, but that surely is a compelling reason for a ceasefire, because only by ending the killings can progress to a political solution take place. So why, even at this late stage, won't he join the growing numbers of voices calling for an immediate ceasefire before this catastrophic conflict engulfs the entire region?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'll just refer the honourable gentleman to what I said previously. Israel has the right to defend itself. It is facing an appalling terrorist organisation which has committed appalling acts, and they have the right to ensure that those acts stop and don't help hurt their citizens again.
Ray Chishti.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome the Prime Minister's work and leadership in engaging with the Arab world in trying to find a solution to this difficult, challenging situation that we face in the Middle East. The question I have for the Prime Minister is this. This is not the first time the terrorist organisation Hamas had carried out terrorist activity in killing innocent Jewish people to derail the peace process. They did that in 2002, just before the Arab Peace Initiative was about to be launched, when they killed innocent Jewish people on the night of Passover. That then derailed the peace initiative for the region. I ask the Prime Minister this. From his meetings with the Arab leaders, are they still committed to the Arab Peace Initiative on the 1967 borders? If that is the case, the United Kingdom was previously committed to that. Are we, and will the Prime Minister host an international summit on a two-state solution like President Clinton did at Camp David in 2000?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one thing we must do collectively is re-energise progress towards a two-state solution. That's been the long-standing position of the UK and remains so. And in all, both my and the Foreign Secretary's diplomatic engagement over the past few days, we have emphasised that, and with our Arab partners in particular, and discussed how we might demonstrate visible progress towards that goal.
Order, order, order. This session has to end at 5 o'clock. Patently, not all members, I'm afraid, are going to get called. We'll do the best that we can. But it would help colleagues if questions were short. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With reports that 50 dual citizens who are hostages may be released this evening, Walthamstow is grateful to the Prime Minister for all that he's done and the commitment he's made to one of our own as a family who've got family members who've been kidnapped to help to release them. Can I ask him about his commitment to also other Walthamstow residents who are also stuck in Gaza, some of the 200 UK nationals, Rania and her children, who are terrified and confused because they've been to the border several times following advice from the Foreign Office to find that it's closed. Can the Prime Minister update us whether any UK nationals have yet been rescued and whether at least there could be a single point of contact at the border for these families if they do make such a perilous journey?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady, I know it will be a frightening time for British nationals in Gaza and their families. We're continuing to provide assistance to them, and they are in contact with the Foreign Office. We have not been able to secure the movement of any British nationals the other way across the Rafah crossing, but we have already had those discussions with the Egyptians, including myself with President Sisi, to ensure that when the possibility is there that they can cross, and indeed we have pre-positioned rapid deployment teams for the border force into Egypt and close to the border to make sure that logistically we can collect them and get them home as safely as possible when that happens.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The new army of online Middle East experts, the unverified bots from nefarious sources, and the rise of sophisticated AI risks seriously undermining the work that the UK and the international community is trying to do to de-escalate the conflict, and everybody sharing divisive and abusive messages, including people in this place, sadly need to understand they are only serving to raise the heat on the families of people with loved ones in Israel and Gaza. Will my right honourable friend confirm that the UK and governments around the world are working to put pressure on the tech companies to tighten up their controls and ensure that we have prosecutions here where necessary to provide the deterrence we need?
Can I reassure my honourable friend, who raises an excellent point, that online offending is as serious as offline offending, and we have robust legislation in place to deal with threatening or abusive behaviour or behaviour which is intended or likely to stir up hatred, and this applies whether it takes place offline or online, and we've worked with the police to fund an online hate crime reporting portal and ensure that they have all the tools they need to bring those who break the law to face justice.
Hassel Khan.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the scale of violence we have seen in Palestine and Israel over the last few weeks has been horrific, and the deaths of innocent people on both sides are tragedy. Prime Minister is right that the violence did not end on the 7th of October, but it did not start then either. Recent wars broke out in the region in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2018, and 2021. What is the Prime Minister doing to address not only the immediate violence, but to bring about a long-lasting peace in the region?
Prime Minister.
I say to my honourable friend that we are working hard to make sure that we can provide the people of Palestine with a better future, because they do have legitimate aspirations to live with measures of security and freedom, justice, opportunity and dignity, and we will strive to build that future for them in all our dialogue with regional partners.
Nicola Richards.
Mr Deputy Speaker, on Saturday, Hen Mazig tweeted that a pro-Palestinian protester carrying a black flag was too similar to ISIS. The Met Police disagreed, retweeted him and publicly said it wasn't true. This caused a barrage of anti-Semitic and homophobic abuse on a scale he had never seen. I spoke to him, and he said that after seeing the most horrific massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, he thought he was safe in London, and that British people always made him feel welcome, but now he's worried to leave his home. Does the Prime Minister agree with me? This example is disgraceful. The Met have a responsibility to protect Jewish communities at this most difficult time, and should be held to account for allowing the barrage of anti-Semitic abuse towards a member of the Jewish community.
Prime Minister.
Well, can I start by thanking my honourable friend for all she does to champion the Jewish community, and I met most recently with ministers and police chiefs and the Community Safety Trust in Downing Street to discuss how we can better protect the British Jewish community at this difficult time, as well as additional funding. But I have been clear, there is zero tolerance in our country for anti-Semitism, and what we have seen recently is unacceptable, and it should be met with the full force of the law.
Liam Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hamas crime was not just what was once called the banality of evil, it was the calculation of evil, which is why Hamas must be defeated. But the Prime Minister is right, there is a humanitarian disaster now unfolding in Gaza, and that's why he is right to say we need a constant stream of aid pouring in. The UN Secretary General is very clear that only a binding on all sides, negotiated cessation of hostilities will allow that aid to pour in, as the Prime Minister said. Is the UN Secretary General wrong? And if he is not, what will the Prime Minister do at the United Nations to bring about that binding on all sides, negotiated ceasefire, so aid can flow and lives be saved.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, aid is already flowing into Gaza. That is as a result of the diplomatic efforts of many, including the UK, and now we are providing not just further financial but logistical support to increase the supply of that aid. We will continue to do so. It's vital that we get it in, and we're working very closely, as I said, with the head of the UN's humanitarian agency, who is in constant contact with the Development Minister.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. 2 weeks ago, Hamas committed an unprecedented and heinous pogrom against Jewish people, men, women, babies and children. We all stand with our British Jewish community. So Rotherham Council Town Hall flew the Israeli flag in solidarity. However, within hours, this was attacked, the flag torn down and the flagpole broken. Rotherham Council is refusing to refly the Israeli flag. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we must stand up against those who wish to intimidate our Jewish community and refly the flag to show that we will always stand up against anti-Semitism and stand with our Jewish community?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have zero tolerance in the UK for anti-Semitism, and I thank my honourable friend for everything he is doing to champion his Jewish constituents at this difficult time. And I'm clear, where people incite racial or religious hatred, or their conduct is threatening, abusive or disorderly, or causes distress to others, the police can and should take action, and those who commit those crimes should face the full force of the law.
Alan Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I was pleased to hear the Prime Minister talk of the need to get fuel into Gaza, but as the Honourable Member for Aachen has said, that wasn't referenced in yesterday's joint statement, even though fuel is due to run out in the next few days, and without it there'll be no water, no functioning hospitals, no bakeries and so on. Can I press the Prime Minister on a question that he hasn't been prepared to answer so far? Does he consider the withholding of fuel to be in line with the Government of Israel's obligations to act within international law?
Prime Minister.
The Government of Israel will manage its behaviour in line with international law. Our job is to ensure that we get aid into the region, and that's what we're focused on doing.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, during his visit to regional partners in the Middle East last week, did the Prime Minister get any sense of the extent to which any necessary Israeli action in Gaza can and will be contained from wider involvement by malign actors?
Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's important that this conflict does not escalate, and that's why both our Navy presence to stop illegal arms shipments to entities like Hezbollah is important, but also the diplomatic engagement we've had with leaders across the region to ensure that those who would seek to exploit this already awful situation for their own further ends are stopped, and that they hear that message in no uncertain terms from everybody.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This weekend I went to Whitefield Shul and attended a vigil in Manchester for the hostages. The community is scared with what we're seeing on the streets. Mr. Deputy Speaker, since Hamas's barbaric terrorist attack on Israel over 2 weeks ago, the CST has reported more than a 700% rise in anti-Semitic hate incidents, and Tal Mama has reported more than a 500% rise in Islamophobia over the same period. Does he agree that there's no place in Britain for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, and that those who proliferate this hatred and poison on British streets will be met with a full force of the law?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've been clear that there is zero tolerance for anti-Semitism or indeed anti-Muslim hatred in any form, and will seek to stamp it out wherever we see it.
David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I have a great many constituents whose families found refuge here in the UK from the Holocaust in Europe, who've reached out to me in the last few weeks to tell me about how they've been personally and directly affected by the ongoing attacks from Hamas in Israel. They would like me to commend my right honourable friend for the work that he's been doing with our allies to bring peace and stability, and pose the question of what further efforts can be made to ensure that once the current threat from Hamas is addressed through Israel's actions, that the evidence is gathered and the perpetrators identified, so that due process of international law can bring them to justice.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's important that people act in accordance with international law, and it's important that those procedures are followed, and indeed that Israel takes every precaution to avoid harming civilians, and in the meantime we will ensure that we get humanitarian support into the region. That those efforts are starting to bear fruit, but we must double our efforts.
Richard Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The horrific death toll of this crisis now includes 1,800 Palestinian children. More children will die while the bombs are dropping. The aid needed will not get through. The UN General Secretary is calling for a ceasefire. So is the EU Foreign Policy Chief. So is France, Spain, Japan and Brazil. We need more than just expressions of regret about the loss of civilian lives. We need action to stop them. So isn't it time to back a ceasefire binding on all sides?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that is a mischaracterisation of some of what some of those countries have said. Indeed, I spoke to the President of France last night, including leaders from the US, Canada, Italy, Germany, and we are united in supporting Israel's right to self-defence, acting in accordance with international law, and committed to getting humanitarian aid into the region, as we are now doing.
Gareth Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to pay tribute to the statesmanlike actions of my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and the Foreign Secretary on this terrible issue. But at the weekend, shocking footage travelled the world showing flags of proscribed organisations on the streets of London, with extremists proclaiming Allah's curse on the Jews and others calling for jihad. British Jews are increasingly feeling unsafe in their own country. Well, what's made it worse is the apparent refusal of the Metropolitan Police to do anything about it other than to stand to one side and then issue a self-justificatory tweet that frankly was an insult to the intelligence of anybody who read it. So what steps has my right honourable friend taken to ensure that the leadership of the police will in future enforce a zero-tolerance policy for incitement and extremism on our streets for the good of all of our people?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, hateful extremism has no place in our society. Calls for jihad and Muslim armies to rise up are not only a threat to the Jewish community but also a threat to our democratic values. Of course, the police are operationally independent, but the Home Secretary has raised this with them, and anyone who commits a crime, whether that be inciting racial hatred, glorifying terrorism or violating public order, should expect to face the full force of the law.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I welcome the commitment in his statement to challenging actions which undermine the prospects for Palestinian statehood. What is his assessment of the impact of continued illegal settlement building in the Palestinian territories on the prospects for Palestinian statehood?
Our position on illegal settlements is long-standing and in accordance with the UN Security Council resolution that I know the honourable gentleman will be familiar with.
I'm sorry, Leila Moran.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I start by sincerely thanking members who have shown me support over the last week. It's been really meaningful. There is a narrative developing that I think we need to challenge. You can stand for Israel and still care about what is happening in Gaza. And you can stand for Palestine and not support Hamas or the atrocities that they have committed. Both can be true. It is an incredibly sensitive time in our communities, and as he'll well know, diplomatically too. So would he look again at legislation coming to this House on Wednesday that has this specific conflict on the face of the bill? Whatever one may think of the content of the bill, I hope he agrees. Now is not the time.
Mr. Speaker, the bill I think the Honourable Lady is referring to delivers a manifesto commitment to ban public bodies from imposing their own boycotts, divestment or sanctions campaigns against foreign countries. Those could be divisive policies that undermine community cohesion. It's important that the UK has a consistent foreign policy and speaks with one voice internationally.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I have, not just now, but for a very long time, since 2007, condemned Hamas for its action, which has always led to bloodshed of Palestinians in Gaza. So I continue to do that. I, of course, condemn the action against the Israelis on the 7th of October, the slaughter of men, women and children. But I also want to look at the issues that are in Gaza. I want support for the people who Hamas uses as a shield to block them. I want their rights protected. I want aid for them. I want support for them because they have a right to life as much as anybody else does. So I would ask for, please, a ceasefire in the interim to allow people to get right sort of amount of aid and to be able to feel safe in their territory. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is right to say that Hamas is using innocent Palestinian people as human shields with tragic consequences. And we mourn the loss of every innocent life, civilians of every faith, every nationality who have been killed. And we support the Palestinian people because they are victims of Hamas too. And that is why we are so focused on getting aid into Gaza. As you can see, those efforts are starting to bear fruit. Of course, there is far more that we need to do, but he has my assurance that we are working round the clock to bring that aid to the people who need it.
Diane Abbott.
The Prime Minister said earlier that aid is flowing into Gaza. Can I draw his attention to the fact that every single non-governmental organisation is saying the amount of aid is only token? And what is he doing to make sure that aid comes to Gaza in the quantities that they need?
Well, I just gently point out the honourable lady, aid is going in, but I also said that it's not enough and there needs to be more. And we're working incredibly hard to make sure that that happens. That is a function of financial support, which we are providing, more than doubling our financial support to the region, but also logistical, which is why the conversations that the Development Minister is having with the head of the UN's humanitarian agency are so important, because the logistical effort required to bring about higher volumes of aid is considerable. The UK has specific expertise, capabilities and equipment that may be able to help with that, particularly at El Arish Airport, and we will work very hard to not just increase the supply of aid into Egypt, but then to make sure that it can get to the people who need it across the crossing.
Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We must all recognise the responsibility upon global leaders to ensure the protection of innocent Palestinian civilians. To that end, may I ask the Prime Minister what steps he is taking to be certain that independent observers are able to fully monitor the ongoing situation in Gaza, to ensure that there is no collective punishment of the innocent and that international law is upheld at all times.
Mr. Speaker, our overriding priority is to ensure that aid gets to those who need it, which is why not just are we increasing our financial contributions to the region, we're intensifying our diplomatic efforts with all parties to allow for the safe access of aid to those people, and to make sure, as I said, that the logistical efforts are put in place to make sure that aid can actually be delivered once it finds its way to Egypt. Now, none of those things are easy, but we are making progress on all three, and we continue to be committed to all of those things, and I'm confident that things can keep getting better, both volume and scale, over time.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, clearly Israel is not going to have a ceasefire whilst it's still under attack, and it has every right to defend its citizens. However, the deaths in Palestine are increasing, and international concern about that is growing. We have too few aid lorries getting into the country. We have hostages being held in Gaza, and we also have the need to ensure that we stop the deaths of innocent people in Gaza. So is the use of safe zones or humanitarian zones part of a solution that would allow the aid to get in, the hostages to be got out, and to save more lives?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I think when it comes to release of hostages, those conversations are happening, as he can imagine, and we are diplomatically involved in putting as much pressure as we can for the unconditional and safe release of hostages. We saw welcome progress with the two first hostages released, but there's clearly more to do. With regard to aid, again, we are having those conversations about ensuring aid can get across the Rafah crossing safely to those people who need it. That's why diplomatic engagement with all sides is important, and we'll continue our efforts with the US and other allies in the region to make sure that that happens.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Prime Minister considered calling on Israel to allow patients in a critical condition in Gaza to be medically evacuated for urgent care?
At this point, there are no people leaving Gaza the other way across the Rafah crossing. That includes people that the Honourable Gentleman pointed to, but including British nationals. We continue to press for that, and we'll continue our diplomatic activity to ensure that those who need to can come across. And as I said, we have pre-positioned border force operatives into Egypt with logistical support to ensure that once British nationals do get across the Rafah crossing into Egypt, we are able to collect them and bring them home safely. But there is still dialogue to be had to make sure that that can happen.
Sam Terry.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has called for a humanitarian ceasefire alongside Leo Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach, Humza Yousaf, the Scottish First Minister, the UN Secretary General and the EU's High Representative on Foreign Affairs. Will the Prime Minister urgently consider a humanitarian ceasefire on the basis not just of aid, but giving our diplomatic efforts the chance to also free those hostages?
Mr. Speaker, those hostages should be freed unconditionally. They should never have been taken in the first place. We will continue our diplomatic efforts to ensure not just their well-being but their safe release, and that's why our conversations with the Qataris, amongst others, are so important, and that shows the evidence of that diplomacy paying off in the last few days. But there's clearly considerable work to do, considering how many more hostages are being held against their will. These people were kidnapped from Israel. They are innocent people. They should not be there, and they should be unconditionally released.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I received an email from a constituent the day after the horrific terrorist attack in Israel. She was worried about the safety of her brother and his friend. They are both Vauxhall constituents. Working with the FCDO, thankfully they made it to the border of Jordan and they're now back home. But I recognise this isn't the case for so many people. So many people still worried for their loved ones. The killing of innocent people at music festivals should shock us all. The kidnapping of innocent children should be condemned. Every night I put my 6-year-old and 8-year-old to bed, I think of those innocent children kidnapped without their parents. We should all call this out. And Israel has the right to defend itself, and how Israel does this matters. The Prime Minister's touched on the humanitarian work that he's been doing, and I welcome that. But calling on and listening to members this afternoon, and from the volume of emails I've received from Vauxhall constituents, does the Prime Minister agree that a temporary humanitarian ceasefire will help get that urgent aid through to Gaza?
Mr. Speaker, we are working on efforts to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza. The crossing is now open, aid is being pre-positioned to El Arish and neighbouring areas, and we are intensifying our conversations on logistical support as well as further financial support. I'm also pleased that her constituents' families were able to exit, I assume, the West Bank. We are also, just for members' information, working on that side of the conflict to ensure we can support those British nationals who have registered with the Foreign Office for their safe departure from the West Bank if they should choose, and border force teams and others are engaged on that side of it as well.
Order. I apologise to the House. We are out of time. I'd like to place on record the fact for those watching that there are a significant number of members who have not been able to be called. And the fact that that is so should not mean that they're not interested. Thank you all very much indeed for your patience. Point of order, Florence Echelon.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
It is connected with the...
It is connected to the statement. Mr. Deputy Speaker, earlier this afternoon, the right